Hi all, welcome to Machine Coding Interview. I am Sanjay and in this course we will discuss the code flow of bill sharing system. So first we will see the directory structure of bill sharing system. So in the bill sharing system we have the idea directory which is related to IntelliJ IDEA settings. Then we have the Maven directory which has all the Maven related settings. Then I have created a diagrams directory which is used for storing all the diagrams. Like this is how the bill sharing application looks. This is the class diagram of bill sharing system and this is the use case diagram of bill sharing system. Okay, so these three diagrams I have created for this application. Then we have the source directory where we have all our code related stuff. Okay, so this all I have coded. So this all I have coded in this application for. So this all I have coded for bill sharing system. So here you can see that all our code is inside source, main, Java and com stupid designer bill sharing system package. So inside this bill sharing system package, we have builders, controllers, DTOs, enums, exceptions, factories, models, repositories, services and strategies. So we will understand all these directories one by one. So first we will understand the models. Why we are starting with models? Because this has all the classes which we have already discussed in our class diagram. So whatever classes we get in our class diagram, those classes are present here. So first we will see base model. So in the base model, we have all the base properties like ID, created date and last modified date. So this ID, created date and last modified date are applicable in all the other classes. Okay, so in expenses we will be having these three properties. In group we will be having these properties. In have to pay, paid by, settle up transaction and user. In all these classes we will be having all these properties because we are extending base model in all these classes. Okay, so here we are using mapped superclass because we do not want this class to create a table. Okay, we just want its properties to be accessed by other tables. Then in the entity listener we are setting it as auditing entity listener class because all these properties are used for auditing purpose. Okay, so this created date will be automatically populated in all the tables. This last modified will be automatically populated in the tables. Okay, we don't have to give any value to these properties because of these annotations: id annotation, created date annotation and last modified annotation. Okay, so these annotations are used for the auditing. And then we are overriding the equals method and hash code method because all the classes will be having some comparisons whenever we are inserting them into the set or when we are getting them from the hash map or hash table. Okay, so for those purpose we are overriding this equals to and hash code method. The next class is expense class. So in the expense we are extending the base model for accessing the three properties: ID, created date and last modified date. Then we have the expense name. After that we have the user who has created this application. We are using it many to one. We are using the annotation many to one because one user can create multiple expenses. And we are using the fetch type as eager because whenever we want to access expense, we want to see the user also who has created this expense. After that, we have the description for this expense. Then we are using expense type. What is the expense type? So the expense type can be travel, food, drink, medicine, hotel, and miscellaneous. Now we are using enumerated enum type dot string because we want to use the value because we want this value to be stored in our database, not their indexes. Okay, if you want to store their indexes, so for that we can use the ordinal. But ordinal sometimes gives issues like it can corrupt our database, like it can corrupt our tables because if you are removing some items from the enum and inserting other items, then the indexes might be changed and which can result as false values. The next property is amount. So what is the total amount? So what is the total amount for this expense? So in expense there can be multiple users who so there can be multiple users who are paying for this expense, and there are multiple users who needs to pay for this expense. Okay, so the total amount which is paid by all the user is called the will be stored in this amount. Okay, then for what currency we are using, in this expense. So the users who are paid and who need to pay are stored in have to pay and paid by. So here you can see this. There are multiple users who have paid for a particular expense. Okay. So those users who have paid for the expense, we are storing them in the paid by classes. Okay. So we have one property user who has paid for a particular expense, then how much he has paid, and then for which expense he has paid. For one expense, there can be multiple users who are paying, and that's why we are using here many to one relationship. And for one expense also, there can be many paid by expenses. And for one expense also, there would be many paid by means many users have paid for this expense. And on the other side we have to pay expense means the user who needs to pay for the expense. So let's take an example. Lots 6 people are going on a trip. 6 people are going on a trip for vacation. Okay, so out of 6 people, one people is going in his own bike and 5 people are going in a car. Okay, so 3 people are paying for the car, and 2 people will pay for the car rental later. Okay, so these 3 people will come in paid by, and the 2 people who have to pay for the expense, they will come inside this have to pay class. Okay, so this has many to one relationship because one user can have many have to pay expenses, and one expense can also have many have to pay expenses. Okay, and then we have the group, and inside the group we have the group name, the user who has created this group. A group will be having participants. We are using fetch type as figure because once we are opening a group, we want to see all the participants. So if you will open Splitwise application, then after opening the group, you see all the participants, right? That's why we are using this fetch type as figure. And in the same way, we are using fetch type as figure for expenses also. One user can have many admins. Okay, and here also we are using fetch type as figure. A group can have a description. One group can have many admins. That's why we have fetch type as figure. A group will be having a description. A group will be having a group status. So what can be the group status? Group status can be pending and settled. So once the group is created, it will be in pending status, and once any admin settle the group, then it will be in settled state. Then in this property we are saying who has settled this group, and here we are overriding the equals and hash code method for the comparison. The next class is settle up transaction. So in the settle up transaction, we want to show which user has to pay which user a certain amount in a particular group. So here we are using many to one for from user, means one person can be a from user in many settle up transactions. Okay, and one person can be in two user in many settle up transactions, and there can be multiple settle up transactions in a particular group. Then we have a user class, and in the user class we have his name, phone number, password, and email ID. So yeah, this all classes are from models. Now we will understand what do we have inside the enum directory. So in enum we have the currency. Okay, what currency we are going to use in our Truecaller app. Then we have the expense type. What are the expense type? We have this travel, food, drink, medicine, hotel, and miscellaneous. Then we have the group status, which can be either settled or pending. After that, we have the DTOs. So DTOs are used for transferring data from one service to other service or UI to server. Okay. So here from the name, it is very clear why we are using this DTO. So we are using it for adding expense in a group. So whenever any user want to add expense in a group, then he would be using some controller. Okay. And in that controller, we are using this request DTO. So here you can see all the properties which are coming from the UI side. Okay, so for adding expense in the group, we are using name, description, user, ID to amount paid list, expense type, created by, and participants. And in the same way, we have add participant request DTO for adding participants in a group. Then we have contribution DTO for adding contribution for expense. Then we have create expense request DTO for creating the expense. Then we have create group request DTO for creating a group. Then we have make admin request DTO for creating a admin. And then we have register user request DTO for registering a user. Then we have settle up request DTO for settling up a particular group. Then we have split expense equally request DTO for splitting up the expense. So in all the DTOs, we just have the properties that we are going to request from the UI. Okay. So yeah, this have all the properties. Now we will understand the factories. Okay. So in the factories, we have 4 factories. One is group factory. So group factory is used for creating a group. So we get the name, description, and creator. And from name, description, creator, we are creating a group object and setting its name, description, and created by. And we are setting the status as pending when the group is created. And for adding the members, we are simply setting the empty list object. Okay. So here members is set as participants, and in the members we are adding the creator first. After then we are setting the expenses as the empty object. Okay. So this is how we will create a group by using the group factory. In the have to pay factory, we have this create have to pay expenses where we are taking user, expense, and amount. So first the object is created, and then we will set all these properties. The third is paid by factory, which will give us paid by object, and for that we are using create paid by expense. Okay, so here you can see we are taking user, expense, and amount, and then we are setting user, expense, and amount in the paid by expense object. The fourth factory is user factory. So in the user factory, we are taking name, email, phone, and password. And after creating the object, we are setting all these properties and return the user. Okay, this you can remove from here because this is not required. So this 4 factories we will be using in our application for creating user, paid by, have to pay, and group objects. The next way for building the object is builder pattern. Okay, so in the builders directory, we are using builder design pattern. So here you can see we are using expense builder. So we want to create the expense object by using this builder design pattern. What do we do in this builder design pattern for expense object? So first, we will be creating all these setters and getters for all the property which were there in the expense. So in the expense, we had name, description, created by, type, base currency, amount, created date, and last modified date. Okay. So for all these properties, we are creating a setter. Okay. So you can see we have created setter for the name, description, created by, date, base currency, amount, created date, and last modified date. Though created date and last modified date are not required because these are the auditable properties. And whenever we are inserting expense in our table, this property will be automatically inserted. Okay, so we can remove these properties. So here also we can remove this created date and last modified date. But other than created date and last modified date, we need all these properties. Okay, and after we have created setters for the expense builder, we need to create a build method where we actually build the expense object. So here we are building the expense object, and then we are setting all these properties one by one. Okay, and then we are returning the expense. And then we also need one static method for creating the expense builder. So here we have created new expense method which is returning us the expense builder. Now let's see how do we use this expense builder. So let's copy new expense and find that in the entire application. So here you can see that in expense service, we can remove this too. Okay, so in the expense service, we have written this statement expense equal to expense, and then we are writing here expense builder dot new expense. So this new expense will give us the expense builder object. So here you can see that we are getting the expense builder object, and in the expense builder object, we are setting the name, description, created by, base currency, amount from the request DTO. And once we have got all these properties, then we are creating expense object from dot build method. So here we can see that we are creating the expense object from dot build method. Okay, so this is how we create the expense from the builder design pattern. So here you can see that we are creating the paid by expense and have to pay expenses. But here we are creating this object by using the factory design pattern, right? We are using paid by factory and then we are using have to pay factory. So why we have used different approach for paid by, have to pay and the expenses? Because factory design pattern is used for creating simple objects. Simple object means all the required fields should be passed here in the factory design pattern. And those fields also are required fields. In those cases, you use factory design pattern. Like we are using for paid by and have to pay and group factory. Okay. But when you have lots of parameters, okay, and most of the parameters are optional, then we use the builder design pattern. So here you can see that we have name, description, created by, type, base, currency, amount. So we have around 6 properties. But out of these 6 properties, if you want to create an expense, then what we need? We just need the name, created by, and amount. Okay, and on the base of these 3 fields, we can create the expense object. But this object may be passed optionally, right? So if you have lots of optional properties, in that case you use the builder design pattern. But if all the properties are important and required, in that case you use the factory design pattern. So can't we create factories instead of the builder? Yes, you can create, but if you are creating a factory for all these properties, in that case you will have to use lots of constructor, right? You will have to use a constructor for name, and you will have to use a constructor for name and type. Then you will have to use a constructor for name, description, and amount. Then you will have to use a constructor for name, description, type, and amount. So like that, you will have to use around 6 constructors if you have 6 properties. But if you are using a builder design pattern, in that case, you don't have to write any constructor, and you will be creating object by using the build method, and you will getting the properties by using their setter methods. Okay, so that is the main difference of using builder design pattern and factories design pattern. Now we will understand the exceptions. So in the exceptions directory, we have only 3 exceptions. Exception, expense not present exception. Okay, so whenever we are passing some expense ID and that is not present in our database, then we'll throw this exception. Group not present exception. So whenever we are passing some group ID from client side and that group is not available in our database, then we'll throw group not present exception. And user not found exception. So for a particular user ID, if that user is not available in our database, then we'll throw user not found exception. Okay. Now we will understand the strategies directly. We have the settle up registries. Okay. So ideally we can create the registry in a separate directory because it is following the registry design pattern. And then the min max settle up strategy is using the strategy design pattern. So here we can see this strategy registry which is used for creating the strategies. Okay. So why do we call it strategy registry? Because it is registering all the strategies in a registry map. Okay. So here we are creating a registry map which is taking a string and object. And once we are creating a constructor of the registry, then we are simply adding all the strategies that we want to use in our application. So here we are using min max settle up strategy and we are creating the object min max settle up strategy object. But let's say if you want to create some more strategies, okay, for settling up the amount in a particular group, then you can add the strategies here and you can register that strategies in the registry map. And from this get method, we will simply get the key, and from that key, we would return the particular strategy to the calling method. Okay. Then we have this settle up strategy interface. So this interface is used for settling up a particular group. So for that, we are taking user ID, group ID, and all the other required repository. And the implementation of this strategy can be seen in min max settle up strategy. So here we have written the implementation of settle up method. So I'll explain this method later in the chapter once I'll start explaining the services. Okay. And then we have a pair class. So this pair class is only having two properties, ID and amount. This ID is nothing but a user ID. Okay. And then we have the repository directory. And in the repositories directory, we have all the repositories interfaces. So this is expense repository interface, which is extend the JPA repository of expense and long. Means this JPA repository will be using expense object whose primary key is of long type. Okay. Then we have a group repository. There also we have all the default methods. Default method means all the methods which are coming from the JPA repository. Generally, they are the CRUD methods and the query methods. So if you'll open, you will get a better understanding of it. So here you can see that we have save and flush method, delete in batch, delete all in batch. Okay, get by ID, find all. So these methods are default methods that we generally use in our application. But other than that, we are also extending the list CRUD repository, paging and sorting repository, and query by example executor. So this is mainly used for the CRUD operations, paging and sorting operations, and the custom query operations. Then we have the have to pay expense repository. So here we have written our own custom method, which is find by expense ID. Means this method will return all the have to pay expenses for a given expense. Okay, find by expense ID means it will be taking expense ID, and from that expense ID it will return a list of have to pays. Okay, then we have the paid by expense repository, which is similar to the previous one. Okay, here also from the given expense ID we are getting a list of paid buys. Then we have settle up transaction repositories, which don't have any custom method, but all the methods which are inside the JPA repository. Then we have the user repository, and user repository is also extend JPA repository, means it will be getting all the default methods like find all, save, updates. So this all methods will come by default in the user repository. Then we have these controllers. Okay, and in the controllers we have the expense controller, group controller, and user controller. And then we have the services, and in the services we have all the services which are related to this controller. So this controller and services I'll be explaining in some times after finishing the directory structure. After this, we have this bill sharing application, which is the entry point for our application. Here you can see that we are using the annotation enable JPA auditing. This enable JPA auditing is used for the auditing purpose like created date and the last modified date. Then we have the resource directory, and in the resource directory we have these two default directories, statics and templates, that we are not going to use in this application. Then we have the application.properties, where we are using this Spring JPA Hibernate DDL auto equal to create. Means every time when we run this application, it will be creating a new database. The Spring data source URL is using the JDBC protocol, and it is using the PostgreSQL database engine. So this is the local host, and the database name is Splitwise. The username I'm using for this Postgres is Postgres, and password is Sanjay. So here we are passing the settle up strategy equal to min-max settle up strategy. Now how do we use the settle up strategy? So just copy this and find in our application where we are using it. So here you can see that in configuration service we are using this property. So we are taking this settle up strategy. By default we are using min-max settle up strategy. But if this strategy is not available in the application properties file, then this strategy will be chosen. But if the strategy is specified in application.properties, then this strategy will be taken and assigned to settle up strategy name. And once we have got the settle up strategy name, we will be passing this settle up strategy name in the strategy registry. And from there, we will get the actual object that we are going to use in this application. Okay. And after this application properties, we have the test directory, and inside the test directory, we have this Java directory. Inside the Java, we have this bill sharing application test. So inside this test file, we have written all the test cases which will be covering our application. Okay, like we have written test for creating group, for registering user, for context load, mean all the beans are available or not, like repository beans, services bean, and controller beans. Then we are testing the participants. Then we are making the admins. Then we are getting the groups. So for all the application flow, we have created some test, and we will be testing our application by using these test cases. For this test also, we are using this application properties. So here all the properties are same, like we had in this application properties. Only one thing is different, which is Spring Data Shares URL. So here you can see we are using the same protocol, JDBC protocol, but here we are using the H2 engine, which is used the in-memory database. So here for testing our application, we are not using any actual database, but we are using an in-memory database, and the logical name of that database is testdb. Okay. And after this, we have this target directory. So target directory is created once we build our application. So in this target directory, we have our jar and var files that we deploy in a server to run our application. I generally use the Amazon EC2 instances or Railway app for hosting my application, but it's up to you where do you want to deploy your application. So the deployable files are available here inside the target directory. Then we have this git ignore file, which is used by the git. So whatever files we do not want to commit to our git server, we add these files inside this. After that, we have the help MD, which has all the guide like how to create the Spring Boot, how to use that. So for that, we have all the available links. Then we have these files related to Maven, okay, which we are not going to use in this application. After then, we have the pom.xml file where we have all the libraries added, okay, like Spring Data for using the Spring Data application. So you would have seen that JPA repository, right? So that JPA repository comes from here. Then we are using the Spring Boot starter web. So all the REST controller and response entity thing you will get from here. Dev tools, I'm not sure if you are using inside this our application, but you can remove and check it. Then we are using PostgreSQL for storing our database in the PostgreSQL server. And after then we are using configuration processor for configuration related things. So we have created a configuration on test. So we are using a configuration for the strategies. So for that we are using this. Then we are using Project Lombok for getting getters and setters. And then we are using this Spring Boot starter test for test cases in our application. In the previous modules, we were using JUnit test cases, but in this module, we are using the Spring Boot test. Okay. So if you'll open any test, then on the top, you would see that we have annotated this with Spring Boot test. Okay. And this dirty context. So this all annotations we get from this particular dependency, Spring Boot starter test. Then we are using the com.h2 database. So that h2 database we are going to use in the test. So whenever we want to test our application, this h2 in-memory database will be used, and for that we have this dependency. Then we have this readme file, and in the readme file we have all the requirements, evaluation criteria, highlights, and the assignment for you. Okay, and here you can also see the use case diagram and class diagram. Then the external libraries have the libraries which we have used in the pom.xml. So all the libraries will be downloaded and displayed here. And this scratch and console is by default created by the Spring framework only. So right now we should not be worried about this. So this all from the directory structure. So now we will understand the actual flow of this application by going through the controllers and the services. So first we will understand the expense controller. So in the expense controller, we have create expense, get expense, update expense, delete expense, get expense by user. So these 5 methods we are going to create. So here you can see the request mapping is starting from API expenses. So this is how the actual enterprise application looks. This is started with the API and then the resource name. So the main resource that we are dealing with this controller is expense. That's why we are starting it with /expenses. Okay. Then we are using expense service interface for the business logic. So we are creating the expense controller, and in this expense controller constructor, we are passing this expense service interface. So for this controller, we will be using this expense service interface for the business logic. Okay. So we are using at auto add annotation. It means it will be using the expense service interface bean objects. So whatever beans we have created for this expense service, that bean will be used in this expense controller. Now we will understand the post mapping method. So in the post mapping, we are not using any path. It means it will be using the API expenses for creating this method. Okay. So whenever any user is typing /API expenses and choosing the HTTP verb as post, then this method will be called. So in the create expense method, in the request body, we are getting this all parameters. Okay, so we are getting name, description, type, amount, paid by, have to pay, created by, base currency, and group ID. Though we have added group ID here, but for a single expense, we will not be using this group ID, because this expense controller is dealing with the single expense which is not related with the group. Means a user can create expense that will be shared with multiple other users, okay, but without any group. So for creating the expense, we are calling expense service dot create expense method. Now let's open this. So here we have this create expense method. Now let's see the implementation. So here we have two implementation, expense service and group expense service. So we will go to expense service because we do not want to use any group for the expense service right now. Okay, for group expense, we have other endpoints which are inside the group controller. Okay, so in the create expense, you can see if the DTO is null, we are throwing illegal argument exception. Then we are getting the user by using the user repository DTO get created by. Okay, and if the user is not found, we are throwing this exception invalid user ID. Then in this statement, we are using the expense builder. Okay, and we are creating the builder object here, and in that builder object we are setting all the properties of expenses like name, description, created by user, base currency, and amount. And after we have got all these properties in the expense builder, we are simply calling .build method which will give us the expense object. So if we open this, here you can see that we are creating the expense object by setting all these methods. Okay, so this all the properties are coming from the expense builder. So here you can see that from the expense builder, this all the properties are coming. Okay, and these properties are actually coming from the request DTO. So we have created the expense. Now we are creating paid by expenses. Okay, so in the paid by expenses, only the users who have created this expense will be in paid by expenses. So for creating the paid by expense object, we are using paid by factory. Okay, so here we are passing created by user, expense, and the amount. So if you open this, you can see that we are creating the object and we are setting user, expense, and amount. After creating the paid by expenses, we are setting the have to pay expenses. Means the user has created the expense. Now with whom he want to share the expense. So for that we have to pay expenses object. Okay, for that we have this list of have to pay expenses object, and the have to pay users we will get from the request DTO. So in the DTO we have this get have to pay. Okay, if you'll open, you can see that we have this have to pay, which is a list. Means for a particular expense, we have the list of users with whom the user who has created the expense will be sharing the expenses. So here you can see that we are getting all the users one by one from this IDs. Okay, and after we are getting all the users one by one, we are creating the have to pay expenses from the have to pay factory. Okay, we are passing user, we are passing expense, and the amount. So what will be the amount? So whatever amount the main user has paid, that amount will be divided with all the users plus 1. Why plus 1? Because plus 1 is also including the user who has paid for the expense. So let's say if one user want to share the expenses with 5 other users, then the total share will be 6. Okay, 5 users plus 1 user who has created this expense, that will be divided with the amount, and on the basis of that have to expense will be created. So this have to pay object will be added in the have to pay expenses list, and then we are saving it to have to pay repository, and then we are saving it, and then we are saving the expense. Okay, now we will understand the second method, which is get expense. So from the ID we are getting the expense, so we are simply calling expense service dot get expense. So here you'll open and you can see in the expense service. So here we are doing nothing except we are just calling the find by ID method. Okay, so if there is no expense, we are returning null, else we are returning the expense object. The next method is update expense. So for this particular expense ID, we are updating it. So here you can see that we are again using create expense request DTO. Okay, but instead of that, you can create a new DTO which will be update expense request DTO, and there you will pass all the expenses. Okay, so that would be the better way. We should not use only one DTO object in all the CRUD methods. So for all the CRUD method, there should be separate request DTO objects. Okay, so we are passing this request DTO object and ID in the update expense method. And here, once we open this expense service, we can see that first we are getting the expense from the ID. After getting the expense from the ID, if the expense is present, then we are setting all these properties like name, description, base currency, and last modification date. So we are just updating these 4 properties, but we are not updating the amount. Okay, so if you want to update the amount, then you can pass the amount for the current expense. The next method is delete expense. So here we are getting the ID, and that expense will be deleting from the expense service. So if you'll open this, if you'll open the expense service, here you can see that we are simply calling expense repository.delete by ID. So this expense repository will find a particular expense whose ID is this, and then it will delete from the repository. The next method is get expenses by user. So for a particular user, we will get all the expenses. So this user ID will be getting inside this user ID, and then we'll passing this user ID to get expenses by user. So if you open this, and if you'll open the expense service, here you can see that we are getting all the expenses from the expense repository, and then by using the stream, we are simply filtering the expenses whose created by is not null and whose created by is ID is equal to the ID which is passed in this method. Okay, and then we are returning the list. Okay, so this is how we are getting all the expenses for a particular user. So these are all the methods of expense controller. Now we will understand the group controller. Okay, so here inside the group controller, you can see that we are starting the request mapping with the API groups. API because we have all the APIs in this application. Okay, and this is the enterprise convention, means all the enterprise uses this convention for creating their REST APIs. So this group is the resources. So in this group controller, we are dealing with all the groups. So here you can see that we are using all the interfaces. Now why we are using the interfaces? Because according to solid principle, if you know the dependency inversion principle correctly, then according to dependency inversion principle, all the high level modules should be dependent on the high level modules only. It can be either abstract or interface or the classes which has only the high level functionality like redirecting the controls. Okay, they should not be creating the objects. They should not be low level modules. So that's why we are using the interfaces here. We are using group service interface, settlement service interface, balance service interface, and expense service interface. Okay, and for creating the group controller object, we are assigning all these variables. Okay, and then the first method is the post mapping of create group. It means whenever user is passing the request to /API group with the HTTP verb as post, then this method will be called. So here we are creating a group, and inside this group, which parameters we are taking? We are taking the parameters from the create group request DTO. So here we are getting the name, description, and user ID. Then we are calling the group service dot create group, because group service is having the method of creating a group. Okay. Now, if you open the interface, then this interface, group service interface, is implemented by only one class, which is group service. So here you can see the method which is creating the group. So inside this create group method, we are creating a group by first taking the user ID. Okay, so from the request we are getting the user ID, and from the user repository we are getting the optional user. And if the created by optional user is empty, it means the user ID is not valid. Else we are going to, and if the user ID is valid, then we are creating a group. So how do we create a group? So for that we have written a group factory. Inside that group factory, we have written one create group method, which is taking the name, description, and the user. So if you open this, you can see that we are creating a group object. There we are setting all these 3 properties, and then we are setting the group status as pending. Then we are setting an empty member object. There we are setting the creator, and then we are setting empty expenses. Okay, and once it is done, then we are returning the group object. So we have got the group, and after getting the group, what we are doing? We are setting the group admin. Okay, so if the group ID is present, then the user who is creating the group, he will be admin for this group. So here we are using new array list collection singleton list user, means it will be setting the admin of this group who has created this group. Okay, then we are saving this group. So this is the first method. Now let's see what other methods do we have in the group. So the second method is gate mapping. Okay, it means it will give us the group based on the given group ID. So let's open this. So here we can see that we are finding the group from the group repository for a given ID. And if the group is empty, then we are throwing this exception, group not present exception. And if the group is valid, then we are returning the group by using group optional dot get method. Now we have this gate mapping method. So in the gate mapping method, we don't have any path. It means it will be using /API groups endpoint. Okay, so whenever the user is hitting /API/groups endpoint, then he will come to this method where we are returning all the groups. Okay, so if you'll open this get all groups method, then it is returning all the groups which are there in the repository. Okay, but although this is not required for our application, since if the user wants to see all the groups for his bill sharing application, then we need his ID. Okay, so this method is not a valid method for a Truecaller application, but instead of this, what we can do is we can write a method get all groups by the user ID. So it will return us all the groups which have been created by a particular user. So that method I think I have not written, but you can take it as an assignment. That's a simple method. Okay, so instead of this group repository find all, you just have to pass here the user ID, and instead of this group repository find all, you can simply write find all by created by user. So this will be the method that you'll be using for getting all groups for a particular user ID. Okay, then the next method is update group. So we are getting the ID for which we want to update the group. So here if you'll open, then you can see that first we are getting the group optional, and we are checking whether it's empty or not. Okay, if it's empty, then we are throwing this exception, group not present. Else we are getting the group by using group optional dot get, and we are setting all the property and saving the group in the group repository. The next method is delete mapping, which is used for deleting the group. So here we are getting the ID from this URL, and then we are calling group service dot delete group. Okay, so here if you'll open, then you can simply see that we are again fetching the group optional, but in the group repository we are calling this method delete by ID. So this delete by ID is a method which is by default provided by the Spring Data JPA. Okay, we have not written any custom method for deleting by ID. So once we delete the object, we are simply returning the response entities. So in this response entity, we are not returning any content. Okay, we are simply returning the void. And if there is any exception, then we are simply returning the exception by using this internal server header. The next mapping is group participants. Means if you want to add participant in a particular group, then what we need to do? First we need the group ID, and once we have first we need the group ID and the list of participants. So the list of participants will come inside this request DTO. So here you can see that we have the user ID list, which we can make the participants of the group. Okay, so how we will be adding the participants in the group? So we would be just calling group service dot add participants. So here we are passing the ID and all the participants ID. So if you open this, then the implementation, then you can see that first we are getting the group, okay, by calling from the repository. Once we have got the group, inside this group we will be getting all the ID, all the users from the request DTO user IDs. Okay, so here you can see that in the add participant request DTO we are getting all the user ID list, and we are iterating all the list one by one. Then we are fetching user from the user repository. Once we have fetched the user from the user repository, what we need to do is we are first fetching the existing participants in the group, and if the existing participants list is null or empty, then we are creating the array list object, and in that array list object we are setting all the participants one by one. Okay, and if the participant is already in our group, then we are continuing, else we are simply adding the current user. Okay, so we can update this line here. Okay, what we can do here, so group.get participants, let's open group.get participants. So here we already have the array list. It means we would not reach to this line inside this, because participants will never be null. So what we can do is we can simply remove this line, and yeah, this should be working. You can also remove this line. Okay, so here now this is the better code, because the get participants will never be null, but that may be an empty object. But if that is not an empty object, and if that participant list has the current user, means the user which we have got from here, in that case it will continue, and if that user is not available in the participant list, then we are simply adding that user in the participant list. Okay, and then we are saving the group. Now the next method is /id admins, means for this group we want to make admins. So the admin list will be getting from the request DTO. So here you can see that we have the admin list which has the list of long, and here we are calling group service make admins method. Okay, we will open this and see the implementation. So here first we are getting the group. Okay, the same process we have done in all the previous methods. We are checking, and if it's empty, then we are throwing exceptions. We are getting the group object, and after then we are iterating all the IDs of admins one by one. Okay, so in the request DTO, we are passing the admin ID list, means the candidate who we want to make the admins, that will be passed in the list, and from there we are getting the user ID. Okay, so we are checking whether the user is available or not, and then we are adding them in the admin list by using getAdmins.add user optional.get. And once we have added all the admins, we are saving the group again. The next method is adding expenses in the group. So for adding expenses in the group, what do we need? We first need the ID of the group, and then we need the expenses. Okay, so here in the expense DTO, what do we have? The expense name, description, who has contributed for this expense, what is the type of the expense, and who has created this expense. Okay, and the list of participants, means with whom we want to share these expenses. So there are two things: people who has contributed for this expense and people who have not contributed for this expense. Okay, so in this list we are getting all the people who have contributed for this expense, and this is the list of all the participants. Okay, so here we are calling the group expense service.add expense in the group method. Okay, now let's open this, and this time it would be group expense service, because this method is related to the group. So if you open this, here we have written this unsupported operation exception, because for a single expense service this will not be applicable. This is applicable only for the group expense service. So here if you open, first we will find the group. Okay, from this statements, after getting the group, we are creating a contribution map, and from this list, from this user ID to amount paid list, we are getting contribution DTOs. Okay, and what do we have in contribution DTO? The user ID and the amount. Okay, so we have got the contribution DTO list, which user has paid how much amount for this expense, and from there we are using this contribution map. Okay, and from there we are putting this object in the contribution map. Okay, by using the user ID and amount. So here in the contribution map, what we want to display, that which user has spent how much amount. Okay, then we are creating the expense by using this create expense method. Okay, and in the create expense method, we are creating the expense by using the expense builder. So now we have created the expense, we are saving the expense, and then we are adding the expense in the group. Okay, because group would be having lots of expenses. We have got the group. In this group we want to add this expense. Now what is the meaning of this contribution map? Where are we using it? Okay, so one group will be having a list who has paid for the expense, and one group will be having a list who are supposed to pay the expenses. Means one group has paid the expense, the other group has not paid, and they are supposed to pay for that expense. So for that we are using this contribution map. Okay, so if you open this double amount create by expense, let's open this. So here from the contribution map, what we are doing is we are simply getting all the entries, means user 1 500, user 2 300, user 3 400. So this all user have paid for the expenses. So there are 3 entries. Okay, suppose there are 3 entries. Then first we are getting the user from the ID. Then we have got the user ID. We have got the expense, and the amount we will get from the value. Okay, so from there we are creating the paid by expense from the paid by factory. Once we have created the paid bys, we are simply saving this paid by in the paid by expense repository. And then we are adding all the amounts one by one. Okay, the amount we are returning from here, means if 3 users have paid for the expense, there will be 3 entries in the paid by, and the total will be returned by this method. Okay, so we have got the amount, and that amount we will be setting in the expense. Okay, so that will be the total amount for a particular expense, like going for a trip, like playing video games, like playing bowling or playing cricket. So these all are expenses, and the total amount will be calculated based on the people who have paid for the expense from the contribution map. Then we are creating the have to pay expenses from this get participants. Okay, so let's open this. So here you can see that we have the list of participants. Okay, we are getting the list of participants from the request, and then we are splitting the amount. What will be the amount for each candidate? It will be amount divided by the all the participants. Okay, so remember, if one group is having 10 participants and 4 has paid, 6 has not paid, even then the split amount will be total amount divided by all the participants. Okay, so the total amount is 10,000. It will be divided by the 10 people if there are 10 people in the group. Then we are creating have to expenses for all the people one by one. Okay, by iterating the expense participant list, and user expense and split amount will be sent to the create have to pay expense method. And here we are creating the have to pay expense, and then we are saving the have to pay expense in this repository. Okay, so we have created the paid by expenses, we have created the have to pay expense. Now we will save the expense in the expense repository. Okay, and then we are saving the group. Okay, why we are saving the group? Because this group is having the expenses. Okay, so this is the expense heading expenses in the group. Now we'll understand the setup method. So in the setup, we are using this post mapping because we are inserting some record in the transaction entity. So for settling up, what we need the group ID to which group we are going to settle. And after then, we will be getting the request body as setup request TTO. Okay. In the request TTO, we are getting the user ID who has pressed the setup button. Then we are calling the settlement service.setup method, which is returning the setup transaction. What do we have in setup transaction? In the setup transaction, we have from user to user, amount, and group. Means which user has to give money to which user in a particular group. Okay, so let's see what is there inside this setup method. It is taking the group ID for settlement and then the user ID in the setup request DTO, which user is settling this group. So here we are calling this setup service interface setup method. Then we will see the implementation of this, and implementation is inside this setup settlement service. Okay, so here you can see that we have this settlement service that we are calling here. So this settlement service we are calling, and inside this setup method we are using the strategy. So you would have seen some strategies here in the strategy directory. So we are calling this setup strategy interface. So we are first calling the configuration service for getting the setup strategy. So let's open and see what is there in the configuration service. So in the configuration service, we are getting the setup strategy inside this initialize strategy method. So initialize strategy is a post construct. Now when do we use post construct? So whenever we want to perform some operation after the construction operations are completed, then we use post construct. So why do we use post construct operations? Because to get the value and to get the beans which are outward here, we need to use this post construct annotation. Inside constructor, this beans and the value of the setup strategy will not be available because constructor is only used for initializing. Once all the initializations are completed, then only bean operations and value fetching operations are initiated. Okay, so after the constructor operations are completed, this post construct operation will start, and here we will get the value of the setup strategy name and all these beans. So we will get the setup strategy name, which is min max setup strategy, and even in the properties, if you open there, you will see that this is min max setup strategy. So we are getting min max setup strategy, and from the strategy registry, if you open, you will see that we are getting this min max setup strategy as new min max setup strategy object. So we are getting min max setup strategy inside this method. Okay, so we have got the min max setup strategy, and then we will come here and then we will call setup method. Okay, so once you will open, you will see that we are calling this setup strategy, and which implementation we will be calling? We will be calling the min max setup strategy. So you can see that this is now min max setup strategy. And here we are taking all the required parameters like which user is settling up this group. Let's maximize this. So we are getting all the required parameters like which user is settling up this group, for which group this settlement is happening, the group repository for getting the group, user repository, expense repository, paid by repository, had to pay repository, settlement, settle up transaction repository. So this all repositories are needed for settling up a particular transaction. So the first thing that we are doing is from this group ID we will get the group. Okay, so we are using group optional, and if the group is not present we are throwing this exception. If the group is present then we are getting the group. Then from the group we want to get all the expenses, all the have to pay expenses. Okay, so we are using this group dot expenses. So from this group dot expenses we are getting all the expense one by one, and then from this expenses we are getting the expense repository, and from this expenses we are getting all the expenses. Okay, and then we are adding them in have to pay expenses. Then the same thing we are doing for paid by expenses, means whoever has paid for a particular expenses, they will be added here inside this paid by expenses array list. After we have got all the expenses, we will create a participant balance. Now let's see how it works. So let's take an example. U1 is paying 600, U2 is paying 400, and U3 is paying 200 for a particular trip. U4 is not paying anything, U5 is not paying anything, and U6 is not paying anything. Okay, U means user. Then how the paid by expenses and how have to pay expenses will work? We will be having entry of user 1 in both the tables, and later we will adjust them in the participants balance. Okay, first we will check in the paid by expenses. Okay, so user 1 has paid 600 rupees, user 2 has paid 400 rupees, and user 3 has paid 200 rupees. So this is paid by expenses. Okay, now we will check in the have to pay. So in the have to pay, that the total amount is 1200. So if you will divide 1200 in 6 people, we are getting 200 rupees each. Correct? So let's see what will be the entries for have to pay expenses. So user 1 will have to pay 200 rupees, user 2 will have to pay 200 rupees, and user 3 will have to pay 200 rupees. Why user 1, user 2, user 3 will have to pay 200 rupees? Because if you will calculate total, okay, from 600, 400 and 200, it is coming as 1200. Okay, means the total expenses done for this trip is 1200. So each user will have to pay 200 for bearing this expense. Okay, that's why user 1 is paying 200, user 2 is paying 200, user 3 is paying 200, and user 4 will also have to pay 200, user 5 will also have to pay 200, and user 6 will also have to pay 200. Okay, so these entries will be there inside the paid by expenses and have to pay expenses, and in the participant balance map it will be adjusted. Okay, so what will be the entry in the participant balance map? We will see this one by one. Okay, so now in the participant balance map we have user 1 which is 400, means he had paid 600, he has to pay 200, the total balance for this participant is 400. User 2 has paid 400 and user 2 has to pay for this expense 200, means user 2 balance will be 200. Now for user 3, since he has paid 200 and he has to pay 200, it means user 3 balance will be 200. So user 3 will not have to pay anything for this. Now user 4, okay, user 4 has to pay 200 for this, and user 4 has not paid anything. Okay, that's why we don't have any entry in the paid by. So user 4 will have to pay 200 rupees, and the same will happen for user 5 and user 6. Okay, so this is the entry which we should be getting in the balance map. So let's open this part. So let's see how this participant balance map is working. So this is the algorithm for getting the participant balance map. Let's open the get participant balance map, which is taking paid by expense and have to pay expenses. So we are creating a participant balance map which is taking long, which is user ID, and double, which is the amount that a particular participant will be having. It can be positive or negative. Positive means that user will get money, and negative means that user will have to pay money. Now, to whom they are going to pay, that we will cover shortly. So we will iterate paid by expenses one by one. So if you will see here, this is the paid by expenses, right? U1 equal to 600, U2 equal to 400, and U3 equal to 200. So here you can see that we are creating an entry for this paid by expense. Okay. So we are first adding the user ID here, and after adding the user ID, we are checking, do we have any entry for this particular user ID? If we don't have any entry, then we are getting the default 0.0. Okay. So we are getting 0 from this participant balance for user 1. Okay. Then what we are doing, from this expense, we are adding the amount. So what was the amount for this expense? So the amount for this expense was 600. So the first entry will be U1 600. The second entry was U2 400. Okay. So the same thing will happen. We will create a new entry because the ID is new. So U2 equal to 600. Because for U2 also we will be getting this default value as 0.0, and then the paid by expense amount is 400. For U3 we will get 200. Okay. Because U3 has paid only 200 for this expense. All the paid expenses are completed. Now in the have to pay expense, we have 6 entries, right? For each user, we are having 200 in the have to pay expense for this expense. So what we are doing here, we are subtracting the have to pay expense amount in whatever amount the particular user has. So in the have to pay expense, user 1 is having minus 200. Okay. So in the participant balance, user 1 was having 600 because he had paid 600, but in have to pay, he has minus 200. So what we are doing, we are subtracting the have to pay balance. So 600 minus 200 equal to 400. So user 1 equal to 400 in the participant balance map. Now we are checking for user 2. User 2 will again, but in the participant balance map, user 2 was having 400 because of the paid by expenses. Okay. So 400 minus 200 equal to 200. So user 2 balance will be 200. Now for user 3, earlier for user 3 paid by expenses was 200, which was added in the participant balance. So here in the have to pay expenses, he has 200. Okay. So the participant balance for user 3 equal to 200 minus 200, which is equal to 0. For other 3 users, they don't have any balance in the paid by expense. Here they have only the balances in the have to pay expenses, which is 200. So user 4, user 5 and user 6 will be having minus 200. Okay. Because the default value is 0, 0, 0 minus have to pay expenses, which is 200 for all the 3 users. So we have got the participant balance in this map. Now what is the next stage? In the next stage, since this is a min max setup strategy, what we are doing here, we are creating 2 heaps. Okay. One is min heap and one is max heap. In the min heap, we will be storing the negative values. Okay. Where the lowest value, which is the biggest negative value, will be on top. And in the max heap, we will be having values where the maximum value is on the top. Okay. So that we can subtract the maximum value from the max heap with the minimum value from the min heap. Okay. So for creating the structure of min heap and max heap, this is the structure. So by doing this, we are creating a positive balance with the max heap, and from this negative balance, we are creating the min heap. Okay. And this is the syntax for creating min heap and max heap. In max heap, we use second amount minus first amount. And in the min heap, we use first amount minus the second amount. Okay. So this is the syntax. And now how we will insert the values in min heap and max heap? By using this participant balance. So we have got the participant balance, and what is the value of this participant balance? These are the values. U1 equal to 400, U2 equal to 200, U3 equal to 0, U4 equal to minus 200, U5 equal to minus 200, and U6 equal to minus 200. Okay. Now we will take all the entries one by one, and whatever values are positive, we will be adding them in the positive balance priority queue, means in the max heap. And whatever values are negative, we are adding them in the negative balance, means in the min heap. Now we are settling up the transactions. Okay. So we want some entries like which user is giving money to which user. So the entries should be something like U1 is giving U2 X amount in group 1. Okay. So this kind of entries we will be having for settling up the transaction. So for settling of the transaction, we have created a list of transaction array. Let's open this. So here you can see the from user will be giving this amount to user in a particular group. Now, one thing is sure, then whatever amount we are getting in the max heap, that should be equal to min heap. So this loop will continue until both are empty. Okay. So 600 would be there in the max heap, means positive balance, and 600 would be there in the min heap. So let's copy this so we will understand this feature more clearly. So in the positive balance, means in the max heap, we will be having these 3 entries, and in a negative balance, we will be having these 3 entries. Okay, so let's write positive heap. So in the positive heap, what values we will be having? We will be having 400, 200, 300. No, 300 will come in the negative because of this logic. So all the values which are greater, they will be in the positive heap, else they will be in the negative heap. Okay, so the 300 will be inside this negative heap, means min heap. Okay, so here what is the maximum value? This 200, this 200, this 200. So all these 200s are the maximum value. So we can say U4 will be on top, then U5, then U6, okay, and then U4 will be on the bottom. This is how our min heap and max heap will be formed. Okay, now we will check for both the positive balance and the negative balance. Okay, once any of this is empty, then we will come out of the loop. Okay, right now in the positive heap we have these 2 elements, in the negative heap we have these 2 elements. Okay, so what we are doing here, we are using the poll method. Poll method means it will take the topmost value of a particular heap. So from the positive balance we are getting 200, and from the negative balance we are getting minus 200. Okay, and here we are getting a user for a particular ID. For positive ID, we are getting this user and we are naming it as user with positive balance. For negative ID, we are getting user which we are naming user with negative balance. And if they are not found, we are throwing this exception. Then we have created a setup transaction object, and then we are adding the values. Positive value amount plus negative value amount is greater than 0. If positive amount and negative amount is greater than 0, means 400 plus minus 200 is greater than 0. Yes, it is greater than, means we will come in this section. So what does this statement means? It means the positive value is more than the negative value, means the user who has the negative value, he will give that amount to the user with positive balance. So this is the amount for this setup transaction. Who will be giving the value? The user with negative balance will give the value to the user with positive balance. Okay, and the group will be this group which we are getting from the parameters. Okay, then we are saving this setup transaction, and then we are reducing the positive balance amount. So what will be the amount now? It will be positive minus negative. So what was the negative amount? It was 200. So 400 minus 200 equal to 200, and the negative will become 0. Okay, so this will be erased now for this case, right? And the positive will become 200. Okay, now we will come again, and now we will come to the bottom, and here we will be setting the created date and modified date and the setup transaction. Though these things are not really required because we are using the base model as auditable. So these 2 things we can remove here. Okay, so we are just adding the entry in the setup transactions array list. Okay, so once the while loop is executed, we have got one transaction. And what is that transaction? So the first transaction would be user 4 is giving user 1 200 rupees. So that will be the first transaction. Now we are checking for the second transaction. So user 1 has 200 rupees and user 5 has minus 200 rupees. Okay, again the user with positive balance will be U1 and user with negative balance will be U5. So this is the second transaction where user 5 will be giving some money to user 1. Right? Now how much money user 5 will give to user 1? We will check here. Okay. So the positive plus negative equal to 0 because the positive is 200 and negative is minus 200. This is equal to 0. So this will not come in this section. This will not come in this section also. This will come in this section. Okay. Here the amount is equal to positive amount, which is 200. Okay. And from user is negative balance user, which is U5. To user is positive balance user, which is U1. And set group equal to the group which has been passed in the parameter of this method. Then positive amount and negative amount both will be 0, and then we are adding this transaction in the setup transaction. So the entry will be U5 is giving U1 200 rupees, right? So these two entries will be gone now. So now in the positive heap we have U2 equal to 200, and in the negative heap we have U6 equal to, this should be 200 minus 200. Okay, so again we have come to this while loop, and we are pulling the values from the positive balance and negative balance heap map. So we are taking U2 equal to 200 and U6 equal to minus 200. Okay, so this will be our third transaction, T3. So who is giving money to whom? U6 will be giving some money to U2. Why U6 is giving? Because U6 has the negative balance. So always the people with the negative balance will be giving money to positive balance. Okay, now how much money he will be giving, we will see now. So we have pulled the positive balance and negative balance, and then we are getting the user with positive balance from this ID and user with negative balance from this negative ID. Then we are checking positive balance plus negative balance equal to 0, positive balance plus negative balance. So positive balance is 200, negative balance is minus 200. So the summation of positive plus negative is equal to 0. So we will not come to this section, we will not come to this section, and we will be coming to this section. So here in the amount we will be setting positive amount which is equal to 200, and then in the from user it will be user 6 because he has the negative balance. Okay, user with negative balance. To user it will be user 2 because user 2 has the positive balance, and then the group which has been passed from the parameter, and then we are saving this transaction. Okay, and then we are setting the positive and negative amount equal to 0. After that we are adding them in the setup transaction list. Okay, so this is again completed. Now since this has been pulled, we have only U4 in negative balance, and in positive balance we don't have anything. So since this while loop will run only if we have balances in both the heaps, but in the positive heap map we don't have any balance. Okay, we don't have any value, so we are exiting from this while loop, and then we are getting the user from this user repository. If the user is not available, we are throwing the exception, else we are setting the user in this group settled by, and we are setting the status of this group as settled. Okay, and then we are returning to settle up transactions. Okay, so this is how this settle up method is working. Okay, one thing I think we have not done is what we should be doing, group repository.save group, because we are updating the group's value but we are not saving. So this was important. I think I have missed one thing. So whenever we are adding any transaction in the positive balance or negative balance, we will be adding the pair. Okay, we will be adding the pair again in the positive balance or the negative balance, whichever is greater. So in the first transaction, so this would be 200. So in the first transaction, when 400 was greater than 200, then the balance was 200, right? So the positive balance amount was 200, and that's why we will be adding this pair again in the positive balance, right? So if you remember, we had U1 equal to 200 in the positive balance when we added the first transaction, right? And the same thing will happen for the negative balance. If negative balance is more than the positive balance, then the negative balance amount will be subtracted from the positive balance, and the positive balance will be 0, and the negative pair will be added in the negative balance, right? So suppose if the positive balance was 200 and the negative balance was minus 400 in both of the heaps, then the positive balance pair and negative balance pair will be removed from both of the heaps, but after the transaction we will be adding again one of the pair again in the heap. So if positive balance pair amount was more than the negative balance pair, then it would be added in the max heap, and if negative balance pair value was more than the positive balance pair value, then it will be added in the negative balance, right? And what is this pair? Pair is nothing but a user ID and amount pair, right? So this is how the setup transaction is working. Okay, now we will understand the next method. So what is the next method? So if you open the group controller, then we have this balance method. Okay, so if you want to get the balance of a particular user in a group, then we would call this method. So from here we are getting the group ID and user ID, and then we are calling balance service dot get balance method. So if you'll open here, we have this definition for this get balance, for the get balance method. So first we are creating a balance variable which is of type double. Then we are checking if the group is available or not. If the group is empty, then we are returning balance as 0. And if the group is not empty, then we are getting the group from the group optional. And we are creating list of have to pay and list of paid by. Okay. And then we are creating the array list object of have to pay and paid by. And this have to pay and paid by expenses we are getting from the group expenses. So from group expenses we are getting all the expenses, and from those expenses we are getting all the have to pay expenses and all the paid by expenses, and adding them in the have to pay expenses and paid by expenses array list. Once we have all the have to pay expenses and paid by expenses, we are simply adding the value of them in the balance one by one. If this is paid by expense, then we are adding them in the balance, and if this is have to pay expense, then we are subtracting them in the balance, right? So this is how we are getting the balance for a particular user in a group. So now we will check the next method, which is getting the user total balance. Okay, so for getting user total balance, we are getting the user ID. Okay, and then we are calling balance service dot get user total balance. So here, this is the definition for getting user total balance. So from the group repository, we are getting all the groups, and from all the groups, we are getting balance for a particular user ID. So we are again calling this get balance method for a given user ID, and we will be getting balance group by group, and those balance we will be adding in this balance variable. So this is how we will get the balance of a particular user. Now we will understand how the user controller works. So in the user controller, we have register user method, get user method, get all users, update user, delete user, get user by email, and get user by phone. So first we will see the interface that we are using. So we are using user service interface for this controller, which contains all the business logic. Then we are using the constructor injection, where we are injecting this user service interface bean in this user controller. Then we are using the post mapping for registering the user. In the register user method, we are getting all the values in the register user request TTO. So here we have the name, password, phone, and email that we are passing in this register user method. And let's open the implementation. We have the user service concrete class for this user service interface implementation, where we have this register user method. So here we are using user factory dot create user. So user factory is used for creating the user object, where we are passing name, email, phone, and password. So once you open this, you can see that we are creating a user object here, where we are setting all these 4 parameters. Then we are saving this user object in the user repository. Okay, and in the same way we have all the other 6 methods. We can go all the methods one by one in this class only, because this class is having all the definitions related to user. So in the get user, we are getting user ID. Okay, and from user repository we are getting the user object. Then we are sending null as we are returning the user object. For getting all the users, we are simply using user repository dot find all. For updating the user, we are getting the user ID and the fields that needs to be updated in the register user request TTO. Here also you can create a new TTO class which can be update user request TTO with all the parameters that you want to update. So from the user repository, we are getting the optional user, and if that user is present, then we are setting all this property, and then we are saving by user repository. For deleting the user, we are simply calling user repository dot delete by ID. And for getting the user by mail, what we are doing? We are getting all the users from user repository, and then by using the stream, we are filtering all the user objects one by one, and we are checking whether their email is equal to the user dot get email. Okay, and whatever object is coming first, we are returning that object from this method, else we are returning none. And the same thing is happening for get user by phone. So instead of checking by email here, we are just checking by phone. Okay, and rest of the things are same. So this all methods are called by the user controller. Okay, So yeah, I think all the controller methods are done, and with the help of this controller, we understood the business logic in all these service methods. Okay, so we have understood balance service, configuration service, expense service, group service, settlement service, and user service. Okay, and all these services are calling the repositories for interacting with the database. So for all the services, they have their respective repositories which interact with the database. Okay, so yeah, I think all these directories are completed. Now we'll see how we can test our application. Okay, so our test is located inside this test directory. So this file is containing all the test. Okay, build sharing system application test. So in the top, you will see these two annotations, Spring Boot test, which shows that this all tests are Spring Boot test. And then we have dirties context. So this dirties context annotation is used whenever you want your application context to become invalid after every test cases. Okay, so we are using this before each test method. It means whenever the application starts, then it will ignore the previous application context and it will create new context for all the new test cases. Okay, so here we are using all the required repositories and controllers. Okay, and then our first test is context loads. So here we are just checking for user service, user repository, and user controller. You can add all the other repositories and controllers where they are injected in our application context or not. Okay, then we are checking our register user functionality. So we are creating users. Okay, and let's open the users. So here we are adding 1 2 3 4 5 9 users by using this create user method. Okay, so first we are creating a users array list object, and there we are adding the users by using this create user method. So if you open the create user method, here we are passing name, password, email, and phone number, and then we are creating a request DTO object, and we are passing this request DTO object inside the user controller register user method. Okay, and the response is the response entity. So from the response entity we are getting this response body, and this response body is of type user. So we have created total 9 users for test cases, and then we are finding the size. Okay, so whatever users have been registered in our system, we want to find the count of it. We want to check the count. Okay, so the size is equal to 9 because from this create users we have added 9 users in our system. Now the second method is test create group. So here we are again creating 9 users, and then we are creating a group. So the group name is Eurotrip, created by 1L, means it is created by the first user which have been created from the create users method. Then we are passing the list. Okay, so what is this list? So if you will hover here, then you will see that this is the list of participants. Okay, so we are adding 2L, 3L, 4L, and 5L, means this 4 users as a participant, and then 1L means 1L will be the admin of this group, and then the description of this group. So after creating the group, we are checking the size of this group. So we are finding all the groups in this repository, and then we are checking the size, which should be equal to 1 because we have created only one group. Okay, and if you open the create group, then you will see how we are creating a group in this test case. So here we are taking the name created by ID, list of participants, list of admins, and the description, and after that we are setting them in the request DTO. Okay, so in the request DTO we are setting name, user ID, and then we are creating the group, and after we have created the group, what we are doing, we are setting the admins in the group. So first we are checking if admins is not null, and if admins is not null, then from the user repository we are getting all the users, and those users we are adding in the group. And in the same way we are adding the participants. So first we are creating the participants array, empty array list, and then we are getting all the participants from the user repository, and then we are saving the group by the group repository. So here we have created the group, and then we have tested the group. Now we are testing the add participants method. So for that we are creating the users. So we are creating 9 users, and then we are creating a group unwind in Goa, where the created by is first user, and then we are adding 4 participants. Admin is null here, and the description is all expenses of Goa trip. Then we are creating a participant request DTO. Okay, and here we are setting the two more participants, 1L and 9L. So earlier we had this 4 participants, and then we are adding 1L and 9L. So there will be total 6 participants. So here in the group controller, we are passing this group ID and the participant request DTO. After we have passed it, we are getting the group from this method, and after we have got this group in the response, we are checking the size. So how we will check the size? By getting the participant size. So this should be equal to 6 because we have total 6 participants, this 4 and this 2. Remember, the created by will also be one participant, but since we are passing 1L here and 1L here, it will be considered only as one participant. Okay. The next test is test make admins. So in this method, we are making the admins. So for that, we are creating users. So in this method, we are creating 9 users. Then we are creating a group with created by as 1L, and then 4L are the 4 participants, no admins, and all expense of customer as the description. Then we are passing the request DTO and setting the admin 2L and 3L. So for this, there will be 2 admins, 2L and 3L. And by default, one admin will be the one who has created. So 1L, 2 and 3L will be the 3 admins for this group. Then we are calling this group controller dot make admins, where we are passing group ID and make admin request DTO. And after that, we are simply getting this group by the group repository. So here we are passing group dot get ID, and then we are getting the updated group. So here what we are checking? We are checking the admin size. Okay. So what should be the admin size? It should be equal to 3 because we have 3 admins, 2L, 3L and 1L. The next method is for testing the group. So we have test get group. Okay. So here we are creating all the 9 users. Then we are creating a group. After we have created a group, we want to get the group, okay, by the group ID. So the group we have created, we are passing its ID here by group.getID. We have got the response, and from the response, whenever we do the get body, it is giving us the retrieved group object. Okay, and its name should be equal to the name that we have passed here. So the retrieved group name equal to Kerala visit. The next method is test add expense. So in test add expense, first we are creating a list of users. So we have total 9 users. Then we are creating a group by the name of travel to Northeast, which has created by as 1 and then 4 participants with no admins, and the description is all expense of Northeast. Then we are creating the add expense to group request DTO, where the created by is equal to 5L. Then we are adding 2 contribution. In one contribution, user ID 2L is paying 2000, and in the second contribution 3L is paying 8000 rupees. Okay. So in this group, in this request DTO, we are adding these 2 contributions. Now we are setting the participants. Okay. So the participant is 5L. So earlier we had these participants. So now we are adding the participant as 5L also. Means in this expense, there will be user 2L, 3L who are contributing for this expense, but 5L will also be there, but he is not contributing. Okay. And the expense type is the hotel type. So we are passing this expense request DTO to this add expense method with this group, and then we are getting the group ID from the response. After we have got the updated group, we are simply checking the expense size. So since we have added only one expense, which is this expense, right? So the expense size is 1, and then the expense type. What is the expense type? So since we are getting only one expense, its type should be equal to hotel because we are passing hotel in the expense type. And then we are checking the created by, means who has created the expense. So from the list of expense, we are getting the first expense whose created by ID is equal to 5L, because in the set created by, we have set 5L. So 5L has created this expense. That's why in this group's first expense created by ID is equal to 5L. Now we will understand the test setup method, which is testing the setup functionality. So for this test setup method, we have created the users. Okay, so we have total 9 users, and the users are Sanjay, Rakesh, Joseph, Hector, Johnson, Albert, Deepika, Kim and Robert. So we have total 9 users. Then we are creating a group Manali trip, and this trip is having 5 participants, 2 admins, 1 and 2L, and the description is all expenses of Manali. Okay. Then we are creating the expense. So first we are creating the add expense to group request DTO because we are adding the expense in a particular group. Then we are setting the created by is 5L. Okay, means 5L has created this expense. So the expense is like this. User 1 will be adding 10 rupees, user 2 will be adding 30 rupees, user 1 gives 10 rupees, user 2 gives 30 rupees, user 3 gives 60 rupees, and user 4 and user 5 are not contributing for this expense. So what will be the per head amount? So first we will add these 3 contributions 10, 30 and 60, which is equal to 100. 100 will be divided into 5 users. Okay, so per head amount will be 20 rupees. So now we will check this in the code. So we are creating a contribution DTO where we are setting the first user as 1L, which is giving 10 rupees, the second user giving 30 rupees, and the third user is giving 60 rupees. So we have 3 contribution object which we are setting in the add expense to group request DTO. Okay, so this 3 contribution objects we are passing, and the expense type is equal to hotel, and the participants will be 1L, 2L, 3L, 4L, 5L. Means 3 people has contributed, but total 5 people are living in this hotel. Okay, then we are adding the add expense, then we are calling group controller dot add expense. Okay, with this group ID and the expense request DTO. So this is our first expense. Now in the second expense, U1 is giving 150, U2 is giving 0, U3 is giving 0, U4 is giving 0, and U5 is giving 0. Means the total expense is 150 rupees, the total contribution is 150 rupees, and the total users who are availing these facilities are 5. Okay, so per head will be 30 rupees. So we are creating a contribution object where 1L is giving 150 rupees, and the participants are 1L, 2L, 3L, 4L and 5L. Okay, then we are calling the group controller add expense with this expense request. Now we are creating the third expense. Okay, in the third expense, U1 is paying 200 and U2 is not paying anything. So here you can see that we have created a contribution object where 1L is paying 200 rupees, and only 2 people are availing this benefit, 1L and 2L, and that's why the amount should be distributed only between 1L and 2L because they both drink. Okay, so the per head amount will be 100 rupees. So we are creating a settle up request DTO object where the first admin is settling up this group. So we are calling group controller dot settle up method with this group ID and settle up request object. After the settlement, we are getting all the settlement transactions. Okay, so we are printing the settlement transactions, and then from the main heap and max heap total we are getting 4 transactions from the result, and those 4 transactions value we are checking. So now we will check whether that value is the correct value or not. So for that, let's run this test case. Okay, and when we run this test case, we are getting this 4 transaction. Okay, so Rakesh pays Sanjay an amount of 120, Joseph pays Sanjay an amount of 50, Hector pays Sanjay an amount of 40, and Hector pays Joseph an amount of 10. Okay, so we will see whether these transactions are correct or not. That we will have to verify manually, and then the test case will verify it. Okay, so since the test case is passing, we just have to test whether this value are correct or not for our satisfaction. So first we will check for Sanjay. Now what is the ID of Sanjay? So for that we will see the create users. Okay, here Sanjay is 1L and Rakesh is 2L. So first we will check the transaction for Sanjay. Okay, so the total receivables for Sanjay is 120 plus 50 plus 40. Means Sanjay will be receiving a total of 210 rupees. So let's check that in our settle up method. So for the first expense, Sanjay is paying 10, but Sanjay has to pay 10 more rupees. Okay, so here the balance of Sanjay will be minus 10 because he has to pay 10 rupees. In the second, he has paid 150, but per his contribution is 30. Means he is paying 120 extra. So here it will be 120 plus, and in the previous expense it will be 10 minus. So user 1 balance will be 110. In the third expense, user 1 is paying 200 and user 2 is not paying anything. So here he is paying 200. means 100 extra. So in the previous two expenses, he had paid 110 extra and here he is paying 100 extra. It means he is paying total 210 extra. So we had total 3 expenses, okay? And for these 3 expenses, Sanjay is paying 210 extra rupees, okay? And if you will add this total, which Sanjay is going to receive is 120, 50 and 40, which is equal to 210, okay? Now we will check for Rajesh. Let's check what is the ID for Rajesh. So ID for Rajesh is L2, okay? So here we can see that here Rakesh is paying 10 rupees extra because Rakesh is paying 30, which is 10 extra from per head. So here it will be 10 plus, okay? In the next expense, Rakesh is not paying anything, but he had to pay 30. So earlier he was in 10 plus, now he has to pay 30, so he will be in 20 minus. So minus 20 is his balance in the next expense. In the third expense, he is not paying anything, but he has to pay 100 rupees. So the total is minus 100 minus 20, means total minus 120 he has to pay. So here you can see that Rakesh is paying total minus 120 to Sanjay. Okay, and how this is adjusted that Rakesh is paying to Sanjay? This we have adjusted by using mean heap and max heap. So in this test we are checking only the balance. Okay, now we will check for Johnson. Let's see what is the ID of Johnson. So ID of Johnson is 5. Okay, so we'll go in the test again. And in the first expense, Johnson is not paying anything, but he has to pay 20 rupees. So Johnson is in minus 20 balance. In the second expense, Johnson is not paying anything, but he has to pay 30. So now his balance will be minus 30 minus 20, which is equal to minus 50. And in the third expense, he was not involved at all. So his expense will not be counted here in this third expense. So his total is still minus 50 rupees. So you can see that Johnson is paying 50 rupees to Sanjay. Now we will check for Hector. So what is Hector's ID? Hector ID is L4. So U4 has to pay 20 rupees for this expense. So his balance will be minus 20. Here it is minus 30 because he has not paid anything. So here he will have to pay 30 rupees. So minus 20 minus 30 is equal to minus 50. And in the third expense, he was not involved. So his total payable is minus 50 rupees. And out of this minus 50 rupees, Hector is paying 40 rupees to Sanjay. Now he has only 10 rupees left. So we will check for the next user. So you can see that Hector is paying 10 rupees to Joseph as the balance amount. So we will check Joseph amount whether this is correct or not. So what is Joseph ID? Joseph ID is L3. So let's see how Joseph is contributing. So here you can see that L3 is paying 60 rupees here. Correct? But he had to pay only 20 rupees. So user 3's balance is plus 40 rupees. In the second balance, he is not paying anything, but he had to pay 30 rupees. So now his balance would be 40 minus 30, which is equal to 10. In the third expense, he is not involved at all. So his balance is still 40 minus 30, which is equal to 10. So you can see that Joseph should receive 10 rupees. Now who is going to pay that 10 rupees? That will be Hector. So from this settle up method, it is very clear that our application is working perfectly fine. Okay. Now we'll check for the balance, whether this balance is working fine or not. So in test get balance also, we are creating 9 users first. Then we are creating a group. Okay. And in that group, we are creating expense. Okay. So here in the expense, 3 people are contributing and 5 participants are participating. Okay. So we will be checking the balance for each and every user. So we can see here we are passing 1L, 2L, 3L, 4L, 5L. Means we want to get the balance of all the 5 users. So user 1 is minus 10 rupees. Why user 1 is minus 10 rupees? Because user 1 has paid 10 rupees and per head was 20 rupees. So he has to pay 10 rupees. For user 2, he has paid 30 rupees. So his balance should be 10 because per head was 20 rupees. So you can see it is 10. Now for user 3, you can see that this user is paying 60 rupees but per head was 20 rupees. So the balance is 40 rupees. User 4 and user 5 are not paying anything, but they had to pay 20 rupees each for this expense. So this is minus 20 and minus 20. So this is for testing the get balance method. Now we will check for the total user balance. Okay, so we are creating two groups, and in those two groups, user 1 is involved. So we will check the total balance of user 1. So for that, we are creating a set of users. We have total nine users for that. Then we are creating a group, and then we are creating the expense. Okay, so we have this expense where we have 5 participants and 3 contributors, and then we are creating the second group, which is my research vacation. Okay, and in the my research vacation, we are creating this expense. Okay, so we are creating this expense where we have 2 contributors and total 5 participants. Now we want to check the total balance of user 1. Okay, so what will be the total balance of user 1? So in the first expense, user 1 has paid 10 rupees, but he has to pay 10 rupees. So user 1's balance will be minus 10 rupees. In the second expense, user 1 has paid 150 rupees, but he has to pay 70 rupees. Okay, so user 1 has 80 rupees positive. Okay, so 80 minus 10 is equal to 70. Correct? In the first expense, he has to pay 10 rupees to others, and in the second expense, he will receive 80 rupees from others since per head contribution was 10 rupees. So 80 minus 10 is equal to 70 rupees, and that's what we are checking here. Correct? Now we will test all the methods. So let's test all the methods. So you can see all the test cases are passing. So yeah, that's how we test our application, by writing these test cases and by passing the request DTO object to the controllers. Okay, we can also test our repository layer and our services layer. But if you are testing the controllers, it means we are testing the entire flow, because controller goes to the service layer and service layer talks to the repository layer. So if you are testing your controllers, it means you are testing all the 3 layers. But even then, if you are going to some company and if you want to have some detailed testing, then you can write test cases for repository, you can write test cases for services, and you can write test cases for the controllers. So yeah, that's it from this chapter. Let's meet in the next chapter. Thank you.